We are going to wrap up DHI 284 U.S. History 2 with Module 7, and the lecture for this week will be on Reagan's America, Bush, Clinton, and a Changing Nation. Before we get started, I want to remind you that your biographical research paper is due by midnight this coming Friday. I trust you've already been working on this. Also, I've included a copy of the U.S. Constitution in your student handouts for this week, and I would really like you to take a look at that and read it. It seems seldom that today in this land that people actually take the time to do so, to read some of our founding documents. I would like you to realize that there exists two primary systems of constitutional interpretation, just as there exists two forms of biblical interpretation or criticism, and we would of course call those literary and textual criticism. But when it comes to the U.S. Constitution, there is a living document interpretation which says the Constitution is not static. It doesn't mean now what the people voted for when it was ratified. That's the living document interpretation. Rather, this interpretation goes on to say the Constitution evolves from era to era, from decade to decade, to adjust with the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a progressive society. In direct opposition to those who interpret the Constitution as a living document is the original or the textualist interpretation. Those who identify as originalists or textualists follow the original words of the Constitution just as those words were meant when they were committed to paper. And it's interesting that most people who would interpret the Bible that very way would also, of course, have the same worldview or interpretive method when it comes to the Constitution. I would consider myself an originalist when it comes to interpreting the Constitution, just as I do the King James Bible. This take on the Constitution does not, of course, discount amendments, which it regards as values that represent a significant consensus. If an amendment was adopted in 1804, for example, those that would espouse the originalist interpretation believe that it means whatever the people of 1804 believed it to mean, rather than what the people of 2020 believe it to mean. Originalists believe that if those in 2020 want to change the Constitution, they must get ratification of an amendment rather than wait for a Supreme Court judge to interpret it under the lens of modern society. Some critics contend that, given its pliable nature, judges can exploit or manipulate the living document interpretation to support their own personal values, which of course has happened often, as we've seen. But regardless of where you stand on constitutional interpretation, the fact remains our nation is still bound by this set of words, and it would behoove you to become familiar with it, which is why I've included it and which is why I want you to read it. All right, now that that's out of the way, we're going to delve into our lesson. The 1980s marked a distinct rise in globalization for America as well as the world. It also ushered in the computer age. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, one of his platforms was to boost America's private sector to repair a ruined economy. This was termed Reaganomics, and Reagan cut taxes and introduced government spending cuts in nearly every area except defense spending. Because the Cold War was still very much alive, Reagan probably did more to boost America's military than perhaps any other president in U.S. history. With the advent of home computer systems like the Apple II, the U.S. military quickly realized and recognized the value of using computerization for guidance systems in everything from nuclear missiles, target acquisition, air defense, tanks, so forth and so on. And Reagan's hard stance on communism helped foster a breakthrough with Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, who was also open to change between the Soviet Union and the United States. In fact, it was President Reagan who, in a 1987 speech, urged Mr. Gorbachev to, quote, tear down this wall, referring to, of course, the Berlin Wall. The wall would indeed come down 2 years later, and I recall this as it happened about a week after I returned from a 3-year overseas assignment at a NATO outpost in the North Atlantic. Unfortunately, Reagan's second term would be tarnished by the Iran-Contra affair, in which involved U.S. support to anti-communist revolutionaries, Nicaraguan Contras to be exact, against communist-backed Sandinistas. Because Congress saw the potential for the United States to become involved in another Vietnam, the illicit arms sales to Iran allowed monies to be funneled illegally to the Contras, the U.S.-backed Contras. The American news media eventually got word of this scheme, which caused John Poindexter, the head of the National Security Agency, or Council, to resign, and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North lost his job over this. Reagan was able to remain popular, however, primarily due to his tough stance against Middle Eastern-bred terrorism. For example, when Libyan terrorists blew up a West Berlin discotheque in 1986, Reagan immediately ordered an airstrike on Libya in retaliation. Reagan also appointed Antonin Scalia to the U.S. Supreme Court, one of the best decisions Reagan ever made, in my opinion, and unfortunately we just recently lost Justice Scalia. But Scalia was the most influential conservative legal voice in the nation. And after Reagan's 2 terms, his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, ran against Michael Dukakis. Bush, who had been the head of the CIA, soundly defeated Dukakis in 1988 and became America's 41st president. His first foreign policy test came in 1989 when he sent U.S. troops into Panama, which was known as Operation Just Cause, to capture Manuel Noriega and to secure the vital Panama Canal. As the decade of the 1980s ground to a close, President Bush inherited the developing fight against terrorism that had begun during the Carter administration, as you'll recall, with the Iran hostage crisis. Of course, this would come to a head when President Bush sent a coalition force into Kuwait to oust Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces during the first Gulf War in 1991. Bush was popular, but when he reneged on his promise to not raise taxes, many Americans chose a Democrat 4 years later, limiting Bush to only 1 term. William Jefferson Clinton became the 42nd president in 1993, and he served 2 terms. Clinton presided over the longest period of peacetime economic expansion in American history. And during Clinton's 2 terms, he signed into law the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Clinton became the first Democrat since Franklin Delano Roosevelt to be elected to a 2nd full term. He passed a welfare reform bill, which significantly reduced the number of Americans receiving welfare payments. Clinton was also president during the civil unrest that happened in Africa and Bosnia. In 1993, 2 U.S. Black Hawk helicopters were shot down over Somalia, West Africa, and Clinton authorized U.S. Special Forces to intervene in that, which resulted in a disaster for U.S. troops during the Battle of Mogadishu. Excuse me. A year later, genocidal violence in Rwanda captured the world's attention, but Clinton took no action, for which he was highly criticized by human rights advocates. Of course, Clinton is probably most famous for the scandals that surrounded his immoral behavior with several women during his 2 terms in office. George Walker Bush, George W. Bush, President George H.W. Bush's son, ran against Al Gore in the 2000 presidential election, and the results of that caused a nationwide conundrum in deciding who actually won the presidential election. The state of Florida was the holdout over the issue of hanging chads, little residues of paper that remained in the little hole where the voting instrument perforated the paper ballots. The U.S. Supreme Court had to get involved and eventually ruled in Bush's favor. And like his father, George W. Bush inherited the Islamic terrorist issue, which came to a head on September the 11th, 2001, when Islamic terrorists attacked the United States, the first time such a thing had happened since Pearl Harbor in 1941. The attack forever changed America, especially when it came to travel. No longer could family members see their loved ones off at the gate. The Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, among other agencies, were created as part of President Bush's Homeland Security Act. 4 months later, President Bush publicly decried Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, and he called them on national television the axis of evil. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq in an effort to bring brutal dictator Saddam Hussein to justice. The invasion was partly justified by weapons of mass destruction, WMD, that UN inspectors allegedly discovered in Iraq, even though no WMD was ever discovered. Military historians have often compared the Iraq War to the quagmire that developed in Vietnam because we faced an insurgent enemy that was able to blend into their surroundings. And while U.S. troops were officially withdrawn in 2011, after President Obama sanctioned the assassination of Osama bin Laden that same year, President Obama sent more troops back into Iraq in 2014 to battle ISIS. And to this day, we are still involved in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Speaking of President Obama, the 2008 presidential election marked the greatest voter turnout in American history, as Barack Hussein Obama soundly defeated Vietnam veteran Senator John McCain. The Obama years marked a period of incredible great social and radical division, polarization within America. The country has never been as divided as it became when under the Obama administration, as well as a rise in the national acceptance of what Bible believers would consider immoral behavior. As an example, same-sex marriage became legal in most states under the Obama administration. And we should understand that since George W. Bush, there has not been a U.S. president who has had openly clear evangelical credentials. What I mean by that is a president that has openly declared their faith in God. We really haven't seen that since George W. Bush. So it really should not surprise us that unsaved leaders would make worldly and sinful decisions as they have. During the Obama administration, his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, drew unwanted attention to herself over the Benghazi incident, which involved the death of a U.S. ambassador in addition to U.S. forces. Her private emails were also an issue, which became a major issue during the 2016 presidential election, in which Clinton ran against popular television personality and billionaire Donald J. Trump. Trump tapped into the deep populist sentiment and mounting frustration with the Obama administration, particularly from evangelical conservatives. And during presidential debates, Trump also openly reviled the corrupt American political system, which he was not a part of, and promised to, quote, make America great again, as he would, quote, drain the swamp. This type of rhetoric struck a deep chord within many Americans who were really tired of big government. And Trump won the election, of course. Upon his taking the oath of office in 2017, there has been a veritable gnashing of teeth and hate campaign such as has never been seen in the history of this country. This was unleashed upon Trump, and honestly, it has shown no sign of abating. As I record this video, July 30th of 2020, and as we approach the next presidential election, there has been virulent, vehement criticism from Hollywood elites, from those on the left, and really everywhere in between. And personally, I believe, folks, that this is a spiritual issue, because the amount of hatred towards this one man is unnatural. It's unnatural. And as we approach the 2020 election, history is literally being made, as we have seen. The global pandemic, known as the coronavirus, literally has stopped worldwide economies. It's altered our daily lives. Social and political unrest is still very much alive, and many believe America is headed for either civil war or revolution, or perhaps both. And time will tell. But as Christians, we rest assured that the Lord will bring to pass the events that will unfold according to His perfect will, His perfect plan. I want to thank you guys for taking this course. I know this was a rather shorter video, the last video, but it's been my pleasure to prepare these lectures and the material for DHI 284 U.S. History 2.